Right. Well, I'd like to start by thanking all of you for the introductions. I think that this is a wonderfully interdisciplinary group, the kind of thing that we aspire to have at the Center for Mind, Brain, and Culture. And I think actually getting to know each other as people at the beginning is very important so we can have productive conversations. So thank you very much for your introductions. I'd like to also thank Dr. Yuki Emoto for organizing this workshop. I'm very much grateful for this opportunity to speak with you. And you mentioned Brendan and Chikako Azawa de Silva, my colleagues at Emory, who were very important in making these connections. And I hope that this leads to some further discussions and collaborations and exchanges of ideas. So I am here today, hopefully. I'll do it this way. There we go. In two capacities. First, as a researcher, Paleolithic archaeologist interested in ancient stone tools, and also as the director of Emory's Center for Mind, Brain, and Culture. And this may strike you as an interesting or unusual combination of things to have a lithic technologist, a Paleolithic archaeologist leading a Center for Mind, Brain, and Culture. So I'll start by sort of explaining this interesting juxtaposition by saying I'm perhaps somewhat of an unusual archaeologist. I am interested in using ancient stone tools to understand the origins and evolution of the human mind and brain. They call this evolutionary cognitive archaeology. I got into this, when I first went to college, I thought that if I had questions about mind, that meant that I wanted to be a philosopher. And then I took a course in archaeology, and the professor, Bill Boyer, gave a lecture about a stone tool making technique. We call it Levallois technique, and explained how these tools were purposefully constructed, made using sequential removals of flakes. Every blow represents a piece that comes off in a planned, intentional, complex sequence of actions that we can see now 100,000 years later. And this gives us insights into decisions and skills of people that long ago who perhaps maybe, what even are they people? This is the question, human evolution. And I thought this is a great way to empirically, concretely study the origins and nature of human cognition of the human mind. And so following that, I pursued that endeavor. This field, though, typically sort of mainstream cognitive archaeology thinks of cognition as a very abstract thing that happens in the head. As you can see, even with your eyes closed, it's about the world of the mind, symbolic representation, things like what psychologists call working memory, holding information in mind. So very abstract. But this is a problem, of course, because the things that we have are concrete. Well, what does this figurine, what did it mean to its maker? How could we know? What kind of capacities were required? How do you relate this abstract world of ideas to the concrete things that we actually have in the archaeological record? I think this is a problem. So fortunately, early in my graduate career, actually the first year when I went to graduate school at Indiana University with Nick Toth and Kathy Schick, I encountered the work of Blondine Brill, who with colleagues had studied stone bead nappers in India. And she did, I should mention that archaeologists for some reason call the flaking of stone napping. So don't get confused, it's not. I don't know why actually, but that's the word we use. So stone napping, they make these beads. And what was interesting to me about this was first, it was an interdisciplinary experimental approach between movement scientists, archaeologists working together. And also, she adopted a ecological psychology, perception action perspective. So in this framework, it's not ideas that I have in my mind that I realize in the world. It's the flow of action from which my concrete understanding arises. And it's a bottom-up flow from the concrete engagement, sensual engagement with the world. And so I found this in both respects, the interdisciplinary approach, well, maybe three respects, the experimental approach, the interdisciplinary approach, and this ecological or grounded approach to be very inspirational. And so for the next 20-odd years of my career, I pursued these kinds of approaches in what I like to think of an interdisciplinary approach to learning skills, the skill in particular of stone tool making, because that's what we have an archaeological record of to look at. It's maybe not the most important skill or the most interesting skill, but it's what we have evidence of. So let's try to understand that. I've done everything from traditional analysis of the actual artifacts, so we can understand as best we can the past skills, and then modern experimentation using neuroimaging techniques, using kinematics, using psychometrics to understand the demands of acquiring this skill, so we can better understand what it tells us about the past, including semi-naturalistic attempts to teach people to make these tools and understand the learning processes. Right, so this work, has led me over the years, most recently, to develop what I call a perceptual motor hypothesis of human cognitive evolution, which attempts to explain the evolution of human technology and cognition as arising from fundamental capacities shared with other primates for sensory motor engagement and control. And in particular, the interaction between processes that unfurl at the level of individual action, even the level of neurons firing, through larger scale interactions between people and across time up into evolutionary time. And importantly, we think of these things as all interacting with each other. These larger scale processes are made up of the smaller scale processes. The more rapid small scale processes are constrained by the larger time scale that they are constructing at the same time. So it's this instantiation and constraint over time. So this is the framework then that I've developed, and I'll talk more about that later. So that brings me to my other role, what I'm here for as the director for Emory's Center for Mind, Brain, and Culture. And this is a center that was founded by Emory faculty in 2007-8. I arrived at Emory in 2009, immediately after this had formed, and I became involved immediately. First, I was recruited to the advisory board. Then after a few years, I was asked to step in as the associate director. And finally, when the director at the time, Lynn Nygaard, moved on to become the chair of psychology, I was invited to become the director of the center in 2022. So I'm about midway through my term as director. The short story for the origin of the center is that it was founded because faculty at Emory basically wanted a cognitive science program. And cognitive science is an interdisciplinary field. There's a classic diagram that was founded or originated in the mid-20th century during what is often called the cognitive revolution, that displaced behaviorism and was heavily influenced by a computer metaphor of mind. And it was supposed to bring together all of these different disciplines to talk about cognition as information processing. However, as you can read in the words of our founding director, philosopher Robert Macaulay, the center may have originated from a call for a cognitive science program, but the center, the CMBC, encompassed an even broader purview. Its mission welcomes engagement not only with scholars from the relevant sociocultural, psychological, and biological sciences, but with interested scholars from the humanities and the professional schools as well. And I think that this is, to me, the very heart of the center is that it's not simply interdisciplinary within the various social sciences, the various social and biological sciences, but very broadly also incorporating humanities and many other approaches to understanding the human mind. So the center was established in response to faculty interest. These are some of the important founders who are on the committee that recommended the formation of the center. Larry Barcelo is a psychologist who's very well known for advancing the concept of grounded cognition. That is, cognition as something other than pure symbol manipulation, grounded in bodily perception. Laura Namey, who is a developmental psychologist. Joe Henrich, who is an anthropologist. You might know his work on cultural evolution. He had a couple popular books, The Secret of Our Success and The Weirdest People in the World, or The Weirdest People on Earth, something like that recently. So an anthropologist interested in cultural evolution. And this was the committee, and then they also interacted with the dean at the time, Robert Paul, to form the center. And it was really in part also his vision of encouraging broad-based interdisciplinarity at Emory that made the center possible. And in that respect, I wanted to mention that Dean Paul also, in a similar time, played a very important role in forming a partnership, the Emory-Tibet Partnership, for two-way exchange of people and ideas, in particular with Tibetan Buddhist intellectual traditions and sort of Western scientific traditions. And so I bring this up. This is another part of the intellectual atmosphere at the time that the center was formed, this desire for very broad interdisciplinary engagement with different ways of thinking. So this is reflected in the mission statement of the CMBC, which is to support and foster discussion, scholarship, training, and collaboration across diverse disciplines to promote research at the intersection of mind, brain, and culture. To me, this embodies a number of core values, those being intellectual openness, rigor, and engagement, a value placed on dialogue across the sciences and humanities, and all of this realized in the form of a pursuit of synergy between different methods, different ways of knowing, and even different understandings of what knowledge is, what knowledge production constitutes. So for example, one of our undergraduate honors students did his thesis recently as a combination between a literature neuroscience review of emotion processing in the brain and the composition of an original string quartet intended to evoke certain emotions, and interviews of people in the audience as their experience of this. And so that, I just love that as an example of the way in which you can have different ways of thinking about understanding emotion all wrapped together in a single piece of academic work. So we pursue this mission in various ways, including guest lectures like the one that I'm giving here, discussion lunches, conferences, symposiums. I mentioned that we have both undergraduate training and a graduate certificate training program. We sponsor workshops and public conversations. I'd like to just highlight a couple that might be more directly relevant to you. One is that all of our programming, nearly all of it, is available online. We maintain, and particularly in the past 5 years or so, as video and audio. It's in a searchable database. You can go to our website. You can look what we've been doing most recently, or you can type a topic that you might be interested in. And this can be a great research and teaching tool to hear some of the leaders in their field talk about different topics. And it's growing every day, so it's becoming quite a resource. I mean, you can see here we have everything from people talking about the cognitive science of religion at our the workshop that we had in honor of Robert Macaulay. Oliver Rollins gave a talk towards an anti-racist neuroscience. We had a talk from Tom Griffiths about the rational use of cognitive resources. We had a co-sponsored lecture with David Haskell about the value of attending to natural sounds in your environment. So you can see there's a very broad range of topics addressed here. And so I encourage you to check that out. The other thing I wanted to highlight is the workshops that I've mentioned. I just mentioned we had a conference in honor of our founding director. And we've had two others, an inaugural workshop for my term as director that I'm going to talk most about today, about embodied cognition. And most recently, our associate director, Robert Liu, organized Sense and Salience, which touches on some of the same topics of sensation, but from a much more neuroscience perspective. So there was the crowd there was much more neuroscience based. So this one, you can see these talks online. These, however, we didn't, because both of these, we moved away from the format of having people give talks like I'm doing now. We had a few short presentations, but most of it was discussion based, which we think we found is a very good way to make these more productive, actually generating maybe new research directions. And in particular, I wanted to talk about this workshop because I thought that it was very successful, and others have told me they thought so also. And this was inspired by my own interest in embodied cognition, and also a sense that there was a moment going on, particularly this is last May, when ChatGPT just exploded onto the scene. There was like, wait a second, embodied. Who needs embodiment anymore? We have these AI that can do everything. You think it's consciously when you're talking to it. Perhaps you were all wrong about that. So this was about, well, what is the status of embodiment theory, embodied cognition now in the age of generative AI? And can it still be useful in both practical and academic sorts of ways? So this is, as I mentioned, I thought the workshop was very productive. And in fact, some of the papers arising from it are going to be coming out very shortly as a theme issue in the philosophical transactions of the Royal Society. And so this is a model that we hope to move forward with, where we have a workshop, we have people generate some new ideas, maybe some new collaboration, and then actually produce a publication out of it, which can also be useful for the administration. Let's see, by the way. But so I've been talking about embodied cognition. So what is this term? You may be familiar with it, you may not. In the introduction to the theme issue, Louise Barrett and I described or defined it in this way, that here we're using the term in an inclusive way to refer to perspectives that question the duality of mind and body and view concrete perception and action in the world as critical to and perhaps inseparable from more abstract forms of cognition. Now, depending on where you're coming from, you may react to this in different ways. You might think, well, that's obvious. Or you might think, well, that's wrong. In fact, critics have said both of those things sometimes at the same time. It's obvious and wrong. So here are the basic principles, offer nothing new. Everyone knows that mind and body are deeply connected, and yet somehow it still doesn't tell us anything about cognition. So it's true, but it's also so I'm not quite sure. I think that the problem to me here is that when you say the mind and body are deeply connected, you're still holding on to the idea that they are two separate things that could be connected. There are things out there in the world, and they're different, and they have some way of being connected to each other, which actually is a problem that philosophers wrestled with for a long time. And I won't go into this, but this has very deep origins in Western philosophy, in particular Platonic essentialism, Cartesian dualism. We could say a lot about that. Other people have, and in fact, I would, if you want a very nice review, I would point you to Louise Barrett's chapter from the Oxford Handbook of Comparative Evolutionary Psychology, Why Behaviorism Isn't Satanism. It often gets treated that way in academic context. But so basically, for what I want to say here is we've had a long problem with trying to deal with this duality of mind and body and talk about them at the same time. And as a result, we kind of get these swings, like pendulum swings of academic fashion, from emphasizing one to emphasizing the other, and never really trying to deal with both coherently at the same time. And the one that I want to most relevant here is the so-called cognitive revolution of the mid-century, in which the origins of information theory from people like Claude Shannon, of computer science, the first digital computers, ushered in a new metaphor for mind, the computational theory of mind, that saw thought as information processing. Okay, so this was a swing way away from the physical into the abstract symbol manipulation. Then the kind of embodied cognition that I'm talking about now, sometimes called 4E cognition, because it's not only embodied but also embedded, extended, and enacted. So that's 4 E's. That kind of started in the 1990s, was a reaction to seeing this as a bit of excessive. And now we could wonder if we're going to see another sort of swing here with AI. And I would say that, it's a busy figure, but I do kind of think that the pendulum swings further and further this way every time, more and more disembodied abstract symbol manipulation. I also wanted to stress that this computational paradigm from the mid-20th century on had widespread effects, not just in psychology and cognitive science, but also in biology, anthropology, the social sciences. So, I mean, you have the computational theory of mind, which Pinker says is, Steven Pinker, he says, is like one of the greatest ideas that anybody has ever had. And in biology, in the theory of evolution, was recast in terms of information processing also. So this coincided with the discovery, the understanding of DNA, and having that at the same time as the innovation of information theory and computer science, it almost very naturally became thinking that, well, DNA is a code, a symbolic code. And so biology is now about information also. Developmental biology is the study of how information in the genome is translated into adult structure. So literally using the terms of like a linguistic code. And evolutionary biology of how the information came there to be there in the first place. Everything is about the storage and transmission of information. And then, of course, in culture, well, it's hard to characterize anthropology because there's always a lot of different theories going on. But some of them that have come along in the past, 50, 60 years, for instance, the cultural evolutionary approach will quite succinctly and literally say culture is information. You can also think of some versions of symbolic anthropology, for instance. Culture is information in my head. So information, which is great if you want to unify the disciplines. But of course, there is a reaction against this as well. I think, well, you've gone too far with that. Andy Clark is very well known for his concept of distributed or extended intelligence, that, it's not all inside your head. And he talks about taking an emergentist perspective. It's not just about your brain and what it's doing, but the interactions between body, world, and brain, right? And the line between, your skin and everything else isn't such a harsh line. We are embedded in the world. In evolutionary theory, if you may have heard of the extended evolutionary synthesis, perhaps not. But it's a reaction to what was described as being a gene-centered modern synthesis in the mid-20th century. It said everything's about genes. So, well, what about organisms and environments? These are surely also an important part of evolution. And in this extended evolutionary synthesis, they retain core elements of evolutionary theory, but emphasize more the constructive processes of development. So this is things unfurling on different time scales. And also reciprocal causation. It's not all about the environment confronts the organism with a problem and the organism adaptively responds, but the organism also shapes the environment. It's a reciprocal causation. And then again, in anthropology, lots of people said lots of different things, but Geertz, for instance, emphasized that culture is about behavior. social action, right? It's not just ideas, it's what people do. And the very influential concept of habitus, or non-discursive dispositions of thought and action that emerge from repeated participation in structured activity. So culture isn't just something you think, it's something you do, right? People do this. So, which brings us back to the forthcoming issue of the philosophical transactions. And there are about 12 main contributions, so I can't go through all of them right here, but they range from a philosophical analysis from Guy Dove to kinematic approaches to understanding the relationship between bipedalism and tool use in human evolution. Greg Downey did an ethnography of free diving, actually. There was a contribution about mindful body approach to creating architecture, that is, putting human experience in an experimental way into architectural design. And anyway, more things than there's a number of contributions relevant to education from Andy Clark's group, Andy Clark, who I just mentioned, about the importance of active learning. It's an example of Montessori education. The use of gesture in teaching mathematics. So a wide range of topics, and I hope that you'll find the issue to be of interest to you when it does come out. In the introduction, Louise Barrett and I did manage to identify sort of two major themes that we thought were particularly important out of these contributions. And one is the relationship between language and cognition. In the cognitive revolution, people like Noam Chomsky very explicitly made language a model for thought. They're both very similar forms of abstract symbol manipulation according to rules, right? And that is what human thought is, what language is. This leads to a problem called the symbol grounding problem, which is how you relate these abstract symbols, which are necessarily arbitrary, back to the real world, right? And so in his contribution, Dove points out that the origin story of embodied cognition is very much about having this symbol grounding problem. And various people have tried to bring the body and perception back into this to reground cognition. And Larry Barsalou, who I mentioned before, is very well known for his attempt to espouse a grounded cognition. And I'll admit that I don't actually know what this says, but I got it from a summary review of one of Larry's articles, and so I'm hoping that it explains, or at least illustrates a little bit, his idea of a perceptual symbol system. That is, in the conventional sort of cognitive linguistic model, you relate a thing in the world to an abstract symbol, and then you manipulate the symbols, and then you have to somehow relate it back to the world and spit it out. He's saying, well, it's not all about symbols in the brain. In fact, how I understand what a car is, I actually simulate internally the perceptions, the experiences, the feel of the seats, the sound that it makes. That's my concept of a car. It's a concrete perceptual simulation. And I can actually then use that in the brain as a symbol. So that was his attempt, very influential. But this does still leave people with some questions, like, well, I can see how that might work with a car. But what about an abstract concept like justice? How can you construct an understanding of justice from like sensation? It seems to. So a lot of people, and Dove makes this argument, would have more of a dual process view, that we do a lot of this, but we also actually do have language. We learn abstract symbol systems like language. They are tools for thought that allow us to comprehend some concepts that are purely symbolic, because we're using a purely symbolic system of language, right? So both of the, it's not either or, but it's actually both that we can do. And I thought that in our contributions, a nice sort of example of this is Downey's ethnographic discussion of free diving. So according to Downey, I've never done any free diving, so I don't know what I'm talking about. But according to Downey, a free diving skill is quite literally embodied in changes to heart rate and peripheral vasoconstriction responses that you can only get through actual physical training. Like I can't give you a lecture about this and suddenly your heart rate is going to change, right? So it can only be done on physical training and experience, what you might call patterns of practice, right? However, these practices are products of a linguistically constructed and mediated community. So according to Downey again, for example, one of the key parts of training is realizing that when you start having diaphragm contractions as a result of having too much CO2 in your blood, and these are very painful and convulsing, you think you're dying and you're not, right? That actually you can go through this, but you wouldn't know that unless somebody tells you that. And actually being told that linguistically is a very important part of the embodied practice of learning to free dive and alter your physiology. So you can get past this critical struggle phase. And so in this case, it's the external symbol system provided by language that acts as a tool for communicating information between individuals, but also as a tool for perception. We label things. It makes it easier for them to identify them when they're going on for us, and make associations between things for introspection and metacognitive evaluation. So the symbol and the embodied experience together enmeshed, and that's the human condition. The other theme that emerged was the importance of the self and the other in alignment. What is commonly called interbrain synchrony now. A bunch of people study this. So for example, Lee et al. Did an experimental investigation of students learning poetry analysis. Okay, so this is pretty abstract, right? This is not like a manual skill, poetry analysis. And they found that the interbrain synchrony between individuals as they were collaboratively learning this skill was predictive of the quality of their learning, right? Yeah. This has been found in other studies, but what they showed that was very interesting is that body movement synchrony was also predictive, and people have observed that. And the question is always, is the interbrain synchrony causing the body movement synchrony and the learning effects? You know, is it just that learning tends to be correlated with these things and they're not causal? So which way do the arrows go? And they showed that sort of spontaneous body movements drive the synchrony, which then enhances the learning, right? So it starts with the body being in alignment physically with the other that enhances brain alignment that enhances learning. And I thought that was a very nice exercise. In Sarai et al. Did a related study of an Islamic ritual of involving synchronized body movements, and they were trying to figure out, are people synchronizing with the people who are next to them? Are they following the leader? And they found a mixture of these things in which the movements were correlated with the neighbors, but the actual physiological response, they measured heart rate synchrony, was driven by the religious leader at the front. So they found both things. So, but this is a very interesting example of the way in which moving together, synchronizing bodies and physiology is a very important part of constructing social bonds. Yeah. And that's actually something that's very important in my own work, which I'd like to turn to now, if I may. So as I've mentioned before, I study technology in human evolution. And so a question that immediately arises is, well, it does for me, because what is technology? Like, you know, so like, and maybe when I say technology, you don't picture a lump of stone, right? You're probably thinking of like a computer or a smartphone. Everybody can agree that things like rockets and computers and airplanes, this is all technology. But what about bodily techniques? Like, you know, an Olympic swimmer. Is that a technology of moving your body in the right way to swim effectively? Martial arts, you could think of. Is that a technology? A meditative practice. Is this a technology of the self? You know? Or should those be called arts or sciences? What's the difference? This is a kind of a complex question that benefits from an interdisciplinary perspective. In the social sciences, technology has been defined as everything from a set of hardware to a system of abstract rules for problem solving. People have called language and number cognitive technologies. B.F. Skinner, who was on the screen before, wanted to have a technology of behavior. And Foucault talked about technologies of production, sign systems, social control, and the self. So what technology means could be like anything, basically. It could be the smartphone in your pocket, or it could be all of human culture and experience. It could be described as technology. So I think I've written about this, and I think it's a very interesting question. I'd be happy to talk more about it. But in the interest of time, I'd like to just throw out that on my analysis, driven by evolutionary theory, neuroscience, history, and philosophy primarily, there are three things that really distinguish or are interesting about technology. First is technologies are engaged in material production, that is, altering the physical world, as opposed to communication, which is designed to alter the mental states of other individuals. All right, so we're talking about doing stuff with stuff, not necessarily with other people. Then that distinguishes technology from much of the rest of human culture. Like it kind of covers, okay, this is technology. That's something else. That's a science or an art. So for instance, you could have a technology of making musical instruments, but you don't have a technology of writing emotionally effective songs. That's an art or a science, perhaps. So the other thing is that technologies are collaborative, and that they involve multiple people, often over extended periods of time and space, and that differentiates something you call a technology from simple tool use. Right? They are collaborative endeavors, and closely related to that is the idea that they are reproduced across individuals and across generations, which distinguishes it from simply being problem solving. Right? But this is like an institution. This is something that's reproduced across time and space, across individuals. So going through these three things, the materiality of technology is critical because it allows the accumulation of complexity beyond what any one person could hold in their head, and provides a durable medium for collaboration across time and space. So technological materials embody knowledge and persist across generations as a new form of cultural inheritance. So similar to the points made by the extended evolutionary synthesis that I mentioned. So these durable artifacts and situations like this workshop are environmental resources that scaffold your thinking, your cognition, by externalizing or constituting and organizing information. Right? I can go into the workshop and I can do something. I wouldn't necessarily be able to sit quietly at my desk and tell you everything that I would have to do and where everything was. But when I'm in the workshop, I can do this. It's a situated kind of knowledge. So this enables the evaluation of complex technological goals and extended action sequences beyond the planning and memory capacities of individuals. And our ability to do this, to rely on this external resource, depends on exceptional human abilities for skilled interaction with the physical world. Right? So cognitively, this interaction with the physical world is supported by internal models that can be used to simulate and predict action outcomes, much as I was talking about before in the perceptual symbol system of Larry Barsalou. Right? So this kind of internal modeling and simulation allows for smooth anticipatory control and action planning. So normally we don't notice that this is going on, but you're not going around the world, waiting for feedback. You just go and do things because you have an expectation, right? But however, if I reach for this and I'm looking at, I think that this thing is full of water, but it's actually empty. And I go to this and I'm going to jerk my hand up like that because I have the wrong model. And then I got to go over. And that's what's supposed to be depicted in this diagram here. So we generate these internal predictive models. So this has been called the physics engine in the brain by reference to like video game design, I think. And it's particularly well developed in humans compared to other primates. and overlaps with what is generally referred to as the dorsal stream of visual spatial perception, or the how stream, which is distinguished from this ventral what stream that has more to do with recognizing what an object is. This is where it is and how it moves. And as you see, yeah, this is work from Aaron Hecht. It's become particularly elaborated in humans. Here's another slide showing a bigger version of that in humans compared to chimpanzees and macaque monkeys. The dorsal stream in particular has become more elaborated. This ventral stream is totally important. You know, we have to recognize what objects are and all of that. But my point is that it hasn't changed as much. It's already fairly well established in monkeys. So what seems to have really changed is this dorsal stream stuff that has to do with the perception and the action, motion and action control. Right. So importantly, this dorsal stream that I'm talking about is also thought to play a parallel role in understanding the observed actions of others and allowing imitative learning by matching the visual perception of what the demonstrator is doing with the internal models I have of my own body, and saying like, oh, well, in order to achieve that, I need to do this. Or if I were doing that, I would feel like this. Right. And so this, using your own internal models to understand what you are seeing, links between the self-action that I've been talking about, the production, with the collaboration. Okay. So this, let's see, did I miss something out there? Anyway, in my own research, I have used neuroimaging and other methods to study these kinds of processes in stone tool production, and to provide a more direct link with the archaeological record of human evolution. I think I just got ahead of myself. So perhaps you won't be surprised that this dorsal pathway that I was talking about for action control is one of our most consistent findings in neuroimaging studies of stone tool making. And this is true whether we have people actually making stone tools outside the scanner and we're using FDG PET to pick up the glucose metabolism that happened during that time, whether we're having people watch videos of stone tool making inside an MRI scanner, whether we're measuring changes to white matter that happen as a result of training. All of these things seem to point to the same pathway in the brain, in particular, this dorsal pathway leading to the right inferior frontal gyrus. And so after a few of these, I actually started to believe this because we're having many different methods saying the same thing. So mostly these studies have come from looking at two methods of stone tool making known from the lower Paleolithic. The older one named after Olduvai Gorge, which dates to more than 2.5 million years ago. And this simply involves taking one rock, hitting it with another rock to break off a sharp piece. These sharp pieces are actually surprisingly effective knives. You can make them quite quickly. And the other kind of tool making that we've studied a lot is this what we call later Acheulean hand axe making, which is from about 500,000 years ago. And this involves actually intentionally making a tool that looks like something, you know, these sort of, oblong pointed pieces, right? And most of our results have to do with showing how this more complicated form of tool making differs from the simpler one. Right, so some of these Acheulean hand axes are quite beautiful, and you can see the sort of the smooth edges, the symmetry, and the overall aesthetic refinement of the artifact. And people tend to focus on the symmetry and the nice smoothness of the edge and that kind of thing. But if you actually try to make these tools, you learn that what's really difficult about it is that you have to thin the piece. You see in this cross section how thin these are? That's not easy to do in rock when all you have is another rock to hit it with. In particular, if you start with a big, thick nodule of flint like this, in order to actually thin the piece down in cross section, you have to strike flakes from one edge that go more than halfway across the surface of the piece. And you think of the geometry, if they don't meet in the middle, it'll only get narrower instead of thinner. Right? That's not easy to do. And experimental archaeologists have learned the way in which you have to do a lot of fine chipping along the edge to adjust the geometry very precisely to bring the edge below the midline and make them smooth and regular and a bunch of other things so that you do this preparation of the area you're going to strike and then you get the effect that you want. So this is much more complicated. Here's another, you have to readjust that so you're not just nipping off pieces, but instead shooting flakes that go nicely across the piece. So that's all probably hard to follow. So here's what Oldowan flaking looks like on a piece of flint, but okay. And this is Bruce Bradley, by the way, doing this out behind the Institute for Archaeology in London. And so what I would like for you to appreciate is that it's very dexterous, and you really want to attend to what he's doing with his left hand here, because a lot of the business, this just does the same thing over and over again, but this brings the piece into the right location to receive the blow and manipulates everything, and somehow does it without slicing his fingers off, and all that kind of thing. And the blows have to be very precise and quite forceful. He makes it look easy, but first time people try to do this, they're just banging on the rock and nothing is happening. On the other hand, in between each blow, like he just takes one flake off and then he just looks, okay, where can I go next? There's no chaining together of these things, right? You do one and then you reevaluate and do it again. So if you're going to make a hand axe, already you can see he doesn't just dive right in. He's taking a minute to sort of formulate kind of a plan. Where is the hand axe inside this thing? You can see this is the part that's going to be a problem for him. This is a nice flat surface here, but how can we get rid of this big hump in the middle and make that thin tool I'm talking about? So he's going to start off, he's removing flakes now, and the purpose of these is to raise this edge so that after he's altered that angle, he's going to be able to flip it over and take a flake in the other direction, which now is a better angle, and it's going to go across into the middle instead of just crumbling the edges, right? So he did a whole series of flake removals that were preparatory. Again, here, he's kind of gone along and extended an edge and created a platform to strike right over the area that he wants to. Again, he can come on, this came off right there, that went all the way into that. Yeah. And then now another one. And you can see how long and thin those are. They're going and they're invading into the rock. Okay, so now he's coming along and he's extending this, what we call a bifacial edge of the back and forth flaking. It's starting to look like a hand axe now, right? And you can see now all this light stuff. He said, what did that do? Well, that regularized the edge and created just the right to remove so that he could get that long blade. Long, thin blades like that don't come off by accident. You set it up beforehand, right? And here you can see he's identified this is a difficult area, in part because there's this chalky cortex still left there, right? And so what he's going to try to do is he's going to try to get into it from the side by working off just a little bit of flaking, just a little bit, taking off little small pieces of rock until he gets enough of a purchase on it. And he created that little stick and the platform that he can come off, right? So again, you can see that the demands for precise action and also the demands for if you mess up one thing, it messes up everything, right? So the chaining together of actions is also much more important. That's the hypothesis. But in order to test this, we had to actually figure out a way to quantify this difference in the complexity of the action sequences involved, right? And so we watched videos like that one, and I identified like 6 different basic actions that occur both in Oldowan flaking and in Acheulean flaking. And then you give each one of those a number or a letter or whatever, and you have a sequence, a string. And then I worked with Aldo Faisal at Imperial College and used grammar extraction methods, basically like compression and some hidden Markov modeling to actually look at the structure of the sequences. And so you can compare the complexity of the sequences involved in Oldowan flaking, which are basically like hit, flake, rotate, hit, flake, over and over again, with the kind of thing that's going on in Acheulean, which is a much more complicated series of contingencies. And we used a couple different methods, and we then correlated that with brain activation and people watching these videos. And again, they overlapped in the very same area that I've been talking about, this right inferior frontal gyrus, right? Which it seems to be very important in complex action understanding. And of course, this is very interesting to me and from an evolutionary perspective, because in my work with Aaron Hecht, innervation, the extension of the white matter into this area in humans is much more extensive than it is in chimpanzees. So that's been an evolutionary change that's relevant to the specific systems that seem to be involved in stone tool making. In our other studies, we showed that this undergoes also plastic remodeling during when people are learning to make stone tools to increase this connection as well. So there seems to be something going on there. Okay, and so this is what I was hinting at before when I thought I had lost my place. This dorsal system that has evolved or has been elaborated in humans and appears to be very important for controlling your own refined actions also seems to be important for social interaction, right? In particular, this is the other major aspect of technology I was talking about, collaboration. You know, technologies are different from simple tool use because they involve these extended networks of people. And this is particularly obvious in sort of modern technologies, global logistical systems and so forth. But it's also true in much more ancient technologies, collaboration, coordination of action across individuals. So at a basic level, this coordination of action between individuals is thought to rely on the same kind of prediction that I was talking about, except you're predicting each other now, right? That allows interpersonal alignment of the internal models that you have of action, of anticipatory motor control. So this kind of interactive synchrony or coordination, again, I talked about it, is called brain-to-brain coupling, can occur at multiple levels of abstraction. And it provides a key mechanism supporting the development over the life course of mentalizing, theory of mind, sometimes it's called, empathy, communication, learning, social affiliation, this kind of connection between people. And these, of course, are important in supporting technological collaboration at larger group and institutional scales. So, for example, effective teamwork is facilitated by emergent group properties, including shared mental models and affective states in emotion, while behavioral and emotional alignment promotes self-identification with the social group. And that motivates norm adherence and allows the assembly of larger technological systems, including the cultural reproduction of technological competence across individuals and generations, right? So take, for example, the sense of agency that allows us to distinguish our own actions from those of others, right? So a lot of this appears to be achieved through the internal simulation and matching of predicted outcomes. I know it's me if the thing that I predicted happens. If I tried to do something and something else happens, that's not me doing that, right? So you can think about even something as simple as using a mouse on the computer screen. Very rapidly, you have a sense that's me moving the mouse around because it's meeting my predictions. And then when you call tech support and they remote control your computer and take over your mouse, you're like, ugh. It's actually very disconcerting when the mouse starts not acting because you like kind of put a little bit of yourself in there, and now suddenly it's been alienated from you. So it's pretty easy to induce this sense of agency or not, and it's all about matching the predictions that you're making of what should happen. So, for instance, there's the famous rubber hand illusion, and you put a rubber hand on the table. Everybody in the room knows it's a rubber hand. Nobody's fooled, okay? But you brush their hand and the rubber hand, and it's an illusion. It's really hard not to see that hand as yours, such that if you threaten the hand, I don't do this to people, but if you threaten the hand, you actually get a stress response, because people have identified with that hand. More controversially, people have proposed that this mechanism may help to explain how moving in synchrony could kind of erode the sense of a difference between self and other, because others are matching your motor predictions, right? So where does my self end. And so this could be an important mechanism also for social bonding. And I talked about the experiment from Lee in which the synchronized movements enhanced interbrain synchrony and enhanced learning as well. So one of the classic tests of self-awareness in non-humans is the mirror self-recognition test. Maybe you've heard of this. You know, does the monkey know it's a monkey? Well, you put it in the mirror, and does it recognize itself? So what do you need to do to recognize yourself in a mirror? I mean, I would argue that a lot of it is about seeing that the image is matching my predictions of that's me because it moves the way I do, right? And so Aaron Hecht actually did a study of this as well that I just think is really cool. So chimpanzees, some of them are better at this than others, right? And the ones who are better at it tend to have more connections, more anterior connections, more human-like connections in this right inferior frontal cortex that I've been talking about as being important in making tools, but also apparently in social cognition. And I think the common thread, the reason for that is both of these things involve prediction of motor outcomes and understanding of complex action. All right, so I thought that that's really a pretty neat finding. Yeah, so this is just to hammer home. This is the same system that I've been talking about that we find implicated in stone tool making, which apparently is also involved in recognizing yourself in the mirror. So which finally brings us to the reproduction of technology. In the interest of time, I'm going to say this is really a special case of collaboration. And it's dependent on many of the same mechanisms for social alignment that I've been talking about. I could talk much more about this, but I think I'll just leave it at that as being kind of also a form of collaboration. So to sum up then, this web of interrelated functions supporting technology has led me to suggest what I mentioned at the outset as a perceptual motor hypothesis for the construction of human technological cognition from ancient primate perceptual motor systems for body awareness and engagement with the world. Okay, so according to this hypothesis, the basic sensory motor acuity and control, well, obviously it allows you to engage in material production in a refined way. You can make the hand axe rather than the old one tool, right? You have that increased level of control. But it also, at the same time, regardless of why it got selected or what was, it's going to also give you an enhanced ability to enter into alignment with other individuals because it's the same mechanism that we use, right? And so this is going to further the kinds of collaboration that lead to the reproduction and elaboration of technological systems. And both of these things create a context in which more of this would be good too, right? And we get a big feedback loop between these various factors, which I think may be part of what happened over the course of human evolution, leading us to have this very elaborated dorsal stream and complex technologies and societies. So I don't know if this perceptual motor hypothesis is on the right track or not, but it does make testable predictions. For example, we could expect basic perceptual motor variation across individuals to be associated with otherwise unexpected variation in processes of technological production, reproduction, and collaboration. And so this is just one example of the kind of hypothesis that could be addressed by an integrated cognitive science of technology. And so one of the things I did earlier was to argue that there's not like one single cognitive behavioral social essence of human technology, but it has these three kind of broad characteristics. And for me, this means that the proper study of technology is inherently multidisciplinary and cross-disciplinary. So it requires a comparative approach to identify pattern relations between contexts, mechanisms, and functions across technologies. We need to embrace this complexity rather than attempting to generalize from a small number of ethnographic examples or experimental manipulations. The scale of technology, it's big. It unfolds over long time periods in large areas, is going to require long-term study. And that means embracing a variety of qualitative and quantitative methods, including some things like emerging methods of real-world neuroscience, wearable devices, ecological momentary assessment, and digital phenotyping. So clearly we have a lot of work cut out for us, but I think that this is exciting. I think these are exciting prospects for research. And I like to think that it's the kind of thing that the CMBC is all about as well. And so I'll just conclude by leaving this up here, the pitch. Come check us out online. And if you want to get on our mailing list, you can be notified of things that we're doing, some of which will be available virtually, but in the middle of the night. I'm sorry. So thank you very much.